Beautiful, it's working. Let me get my phone off the table. Everything clear and in order. The expert IELTS teachers here at E2 Language. In this live class, I'm going to teach you how to do IELTS academic writing task 1. We're going to focus on line graphs, which may on test day look something like this. You need to describe this in 150 words or more in under 20 minutes. What are you going to do on test day? Because you need a structure, you need a method to do this. The first thing that you should do is read the description, because it will describe what the graph is about in some minor detail. This one here is written here at the top. It says this. You want to read this sentence very carefully. The graph below shows the macronutrient intake of Australians in terms of kilocalories per day per person from 1909 to 2006. Okay, fine. The macronutrient intake. Now, if we remember, I think this was carbohydrate. This one was fat. And then below that was actually protein. So they must be macronutrients. Now, it's in kilocalories, which you can see here, 1600, 1400, etc. They're the kilocalories. Okay, fine. And from 1909 to 2006, well, this is the time. This is the time arrow here. So this must be 2006 here, etc. Cool. So what do you have to do? Well, here's the instruction, and it really tells you to do 3 things. It says summarize the information, which we will do. It says select and report the main features, which we will do. And it also says make comparisons, which we will also do. And if we do this, we will satisfy the IELTS examiners and we will hopefully get a high score, right? As long as your grammar and your vocabulary is good. Let me show you a structure that works. So we need a superstructure. The superstructure basically has 3 parts, which goes back to that instruction. We want to summarize, we want to describe, we want to compare. These are the 3 things: summarize, describe, compare. So this is what it's going to look like on test day after we've summarized, described, and compared. It's going to have 3 separate paragraphs. The first one is the shortest, and then a sort of medium-sized one, and then a big bulky paragraph at the end. Fine. How do we summarize? Well, that's this one here. Let me read you this. It says the given line graph represents the amount of fat, carbohydrate, and protein, macronutrients, consumed by Australians over a 97-year period. Macronutrient consumption is measured in kilocalories. How did I do that? All I did was I rewrote that task, that description, in my own words. So what I did was I sort of broke it down. This one said the graph represents, I said the line graph given. This says shows, I said represents. Macronutrient intake, I said the amount of blah, blah, blah eaten, etc. Please rewrite the task description in your own words. I will give you 2 minutes. It can be 1 or 2 sentences, that's fine. For those of you on YouTube, if you're having trouble viewing my screen clearly, please change the screen settings to standard definition or high definition 720p, if you can do that. Cool. Let's have a look at you guys here in the webinar. Please write your sentences in there. That's fine. I'm going to move on. I don't want to spend too much time doing this. You can always come back and watch this video, either if you're a paid user. Yes, paid users certainly can. Cool. So we've rewritten the task in our own words. So I wrote, the given line graph represents the amount of fat, carbohydrate, and protein or macronutrients consumed by Australians over a 97-year period. Macronutrient consumption is measured in kilocalories. Okay. Now we're going to describe main trends and key features. Now, importantly, when we do this, we're not going to mention data. We're not going to mention particularly the x-axis. We could mention the y-axis, that's fine. Sorry, vice versa. We don't want to mention the y-axis. We can mention the x-axis, that might be okay. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so on the left-hand side, I look at this graph and I want to just describe it broadly, not in detail. Okay, so the first thing that I see is that Australians ate more carbohydrates than any other, than fat, and protein was the lowest. So there seems to be a hierarchy here. We've got 1, 2, 3. We've got the most consumed, and we've got the lowest consumed. So I'm going to write a sentence here where I describe that, where I describe which was most consumed and which was least consumed. Then I'm going to do this. I'm going to look at number 2. I'm going to describe overall carb trend. So this is carbohydrate. So I'm just going to look at this trend here, and it sort of went down and then went back up. Okay, so I'm just going to very briefly describe that. No details. I'm not going to use any of this axis here, none of these numbers, okay? And in fact, I'm not really going to use any of the x-axis either. Then number 3, I'm going to describe, just in generally, not in detail, overall fat trend. And this to me looks like a slight upward trend. And then 4th sentence, I'm going to describe the overall protein trend. And this sort of remained relatively stable, maybe a very slight increase. So I'm going to read you mine, and then I want you to do it. I said, overall, carbohydrates were the most consumed macronutrient, followed by fat and then protein. The amount of carbohydrate consumed fell slightly before rising again. Fat consumption rose slightly over the time. Protein remained relatively stable. So I've written 4 sentences. I want you to do that. Please write these 4 sentences. I'll give you 4 minutes. All right, let me have a look at what you guys have written. Okay, it was reported that the highest consumption of carbohydrates was, okay, 1400 kilocalories per day. No, we don't want to mention data, not yet. We're just mentioning things broadly in general, so no data from the graph. Okay, that's fine though. Actually, it's not fine. Don't mention data from the graph. That comes next. In the following paragraph, we're going to get specific. We're going to write in detail about what we see. Keep going. I want you to finish your 4 sentences, please. Whoops. Good. So Sammy's got a good sentence on YouTube. It says, according to the diagram, according to the graph, protein consumption is higher, followed by carbohydrate and fat respectively, except that that's wrong. Carbohydrate was the most consumed, followed by fat and protein. But it's a good sentence. Structure, good sentence structure. Jan's written, here I would like to describe, no use of the personal pronoun I in academic writing task 1. Sorry. Good. Andrej, Vodianova. Overall, it can be seen that carbohydrates are the most consumed macronutrient in Australia, followed by fats and protein as the least among the 3. Carbohydrates follow a fluctuating pattern. Good. Looking good. Well done, Andre. Asu Acharya. Overall, carbohydrates were the most consumed macronutrient compared to protein and fat throughout the period. Good. Carbohydrate intake rose steadily, followed by fat intake, while fat intake remained stable. Good, that's fine. That's fine. One more. No, that's fine. Good. Another couple of minutes to finish your 4 sentences. Just let me have a look at you guys here in the chat. What's happening? I hate iTunes. I've got to say, just let me kill iTunes for a second. I hate how it pops up and makes you want to listen to it and asks you to download it. Go away, iTunes. I don't like you. And photos, what's going on there? Crazy. All right, let's go back here. Here we are. Let's go into the chat. Overall, Australians consume carbohydrates the most. The amount of carbohydrate consumed showed fluctuation before it slightly decreased. Fat consumption increased gradually over the period. Protein consumption remained steady. Good. That's nice. That's nice. That's on target. On target. The amount of carbohydrate consumption was high. Full stop. Overall carbohydrate consumption was getting up and down, was increasing and decreasing, was fluctuating. Fluctuating is the word. Fluctuated. The graph shows that fat's tendency was similar to carbohydrates. Good, that's fine. Alvera, overall, the most consumed macronutrient was carbohydrate, followed by fat and then protein. Carbohydrate fluctuated before experiencing a rise towards the end of the year. Fat, on the other hand, demonstrated a gradual increase. Good. They're looking good. They're just broad descriptions of the trends. You can also do key features, but it doesn't really suit this graph. Cool. Let me show you mine again. No, I'm going to go back. I want to read this again. So this is my first sentence. I said, overall, carbohydrates were the most consumed macronutrient, followed by fat and then protein. The amount of carbohydrate consumed fell slightly before rising again. Fat consumption rose slightly over time. Protein remained relatively stable. Very clear, very simple descriptions of each of those trends. Fine. Let's now do the difficult bit where we have to compare the data. Okay, you have to compare data. How do we do this? I'm going to read you this one. Just let me move my drawing tool here. In 1909, carbohydrate intake was around 1,400 kilocalories per day. While constantly fluctuating, the trend decreased until about 1962 before rising again to a peak in the late 1900s. By 2006, it was being consumed at around 1,300 kilocalories per day. In contrast, fat followed a more linear trend over the period. Although there were constant slight fluctuations, the amount of fat consumed rose from just below 800 kilocalories per day to approximately 950 kilocalories per day. Comparatively, protein followed the most stable trend, barely changing over the 97 years. It started at just below 300 kilocalories per day and finished in 2006 at perhaps just above 300 kilocalories per day. There was one slight deviation which occurred in 1941 and lasted for several years. Fine, so what have I done here? What I have done is this. I have described the carbohydrate trend this time in detail, okay? In detail, and I've used data from here. I've talked about kilocalories, and I've also used data from the x-axis. I've talked about the years, and I've said, okay, here it sort of started to decrease by 1929. Here it started to increase. So you've got to use your eyes to do that. Now, what I have then done is I've put a comparative link between carb and fat. And I said in contrast. Okay, this is how we compare the data in contrast. Then I did the same thing. I described fat in detail. So I just want you now just to write one sentence. Please describe carbohydrates in detail. This line here. I want you to describe this one here in detail, and I want you to use data from here as well as the time period. You might have to write about 3 sentences. Okay, let's have a look at your sentences. Plural, how is it looking? Okay. According to the graph, the carbohydrate consumption was just over 1,400 kilocalories per day and showed fluctuation until reaching a peak in 1999 before decreasing again. Good, well done, that's looking good. Overall, yes. Yes. Okay, good. Keep it up, keep it up. I want you to finish these sentences and please type them into the chat when you're done so I know you're done. Good. Okay, you don't have to write single sentences here. You can write multiple sentences. Okay, let's have a look. 1,400 carbohydrates were consumed in 1990. Okay, yeah, it's actually per day. 1,400 kilocalories per day were consumed in 1909. Over a period of 20 years, the carbohydrate consumption kept on fluctuating. Okay, there was an overall fluctuation in the intake of carbohydrates. Initially in 1909, the consumption of carbohydrates was 1,400 per person. Then it declined steadily up to 1,000 kilocalories per person, took in a day and rose up to, okay, good. That's looking good. Well done, well done, well done. Now what you want to do is you want to link that to the following sentence about fat. Okay, so now we want to describe fat, but we want to put a clever little device in here. We want to say in contrast. Okay, in contrast. Then we want to talk about fat. What happened with fat? Please write your not a single, please write your detailed description of what happened with the consumption of fat over the period from 1909 to 1999. Whoopsie, let me see what's going here. Here we go. On the contrary, the intake of fat kept on increasing slowly. Good. In 1909, it was slightly less than 800 kilocalories and reached a peak of 1,000 kilocalories in 1999. Good, well done. On the other hand, the fat consumption was just under 800 kilocalories per day in 1909 and gradually showed increasing trend, which reached up to 1,000 kilocalories until 1999. Conversely, fat consumption started at roughly 800 kilocalories per person per day. This figure showed a steady increase throughout the 90-year period, reaching to about 1,000 kilocalories per day for each person. In contrast, the fluctuation of fat consumption since 1909 up to 2008 was slight, starting from 800 per day per person. Good, that's looking good. Well done, well done, well done. Last one, let's do protein. This should be a bit simpler. But again, I want you to put a comparative link between fat and protein. I want you to use in contrast or conversely or on one of those sorts of discourse markers. All right, let's have a look here. Moreover, in contrast to the fat consumption, however, not however. However is the wrong word. We want to use a contrasting word. In comparison, in contrast, comparatively, okay? Not however. So let's do in comparison, protein consumption per day remains steady under 400 kilocalories over the period of time. Good, well done, that's good. Just under 400 kilocalories. That was a good observation and well written. By stark contrast, it's not stark contrast, that's probably a little bit too much. Just by contrast, protein being the least consumed macronutrient in Australia, okay, long subject there, a little bit too long. I would say by contrast, protein was the least consumed macronutrient in Australia, not being the least, was the least, with around 300 kilocalories per day per person in 1909. Full stop. It showed stability throughout the given period. Good. Conversely, the consumption of protein was the least when compared to other macronutrients. In 1909, it was a little below 300 kilocalories and didn't increase that much until 1999. Nice, that's looking good, that's looking good. Let me show you mine again. I said this, in 1909, carbohydrate intake was around 1,400 kilocalories per day. While constantly fluctuating, the trend decreased until about 1962, before rising again to a peak in the late 1990s. By 2006, it was being consumed at around 1,300 kilocalories per day. In contrast, fat followed a more linear trend over the period. Although there were constant slight fluctuations, the amount of fat consumed rose from just below 800 kilocalories per day to approximately 950 per day. Comparatively, protein followed the most stable trend, barely changing over the 97 years. It started at just below 300 kilocalories per day and finished in 2006 at perhaps just above 300 per day. There was one slight deviation which occurred in 1941 and lasted for several years. So let's recap what we have learned. We've learned that you really need to do 3 things, okay? 3 things. We know how to summarize the graph. That's easy. You just rewrite the task description. Fine, that's easy. Then in the second part, we describe main trends or key features depending on what we're looking at with no data, okay? We don't want to use that y-axis. No data needed. Just very general trends. Then what we do in the third part, in the biggest paragraph, is we describe in detail and compare. And we compare by using those words like in contrast, and what's another one? Conversely might be a nice one, etc. We want to use these types of words between the fat and the carbohydrate and the protein. Cool. So overall, that's what we're going to write. I think mine was about 180 words, so it was probably a little bit too much. You just need to clear 150 words, and you will get there, but perhaps you need help. Perhaps you need to go to e2language.com. Perhaps you need, I don't know, feedback. Perhaps you need tutorials. Perhaps you need materials. Perhaps you need methods lessons. It's up to you. If you do need help, check out the website. If you're on YouTube right now, please do click like and leave a comment on this video. I'm going to leave it there. If you have any questions, please feel free to email hello@e2language.com. Okay, hello@e2language.com. Thanks very much for coming. I appreciate it, and I'll see you guys soon. Whoops, what have I done? Go back there, go back here. Cool.